I'm really flattered by this turnout. I am taller in person, it's true. We have a great panel here. To my right is Libby Cheney, who is Vice President of Safety, Environmental, and Sustainable Development for Shell. We have, to her right, Robert Gagosian, who's President and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which I believe is a Washington-based nonprofit that encompasses a lot of the scientific organizations that are studying the oceans. To his right is Bruce Babbitt, the former Secretary of the Interior, former governor of Arizona. I'll tell you, this morning I said, do we call you Secretary Babbitt or Governor Babbitt? And he said, Your Excellency would be okay. And then finally we have Kevin Costner, who we all know, who is an actor and an entrepreneur. And he's the co-founding partner of Ocean Therapy Solutions and Westpac Resources. He's been in the arena helping clean up this spill, and he's going to tell us about what's been going on down there with cleaning up the oil. So we're going to each have a quick opening statement. I want to throw out the real question, which is, where do we go from here? These very powerful photos we've seen show you how devastating this event was. It happened on April 20th. It's not over. It's a very fluid situation. Obviously, they haven't plugged the well. I think the situation is much better since July 15th because they have a cap on the well that is holding. And maybe by the time of the 5th anniversary of Katrina rolls around, they can say we've killed this well. Let's hope that is the case. But our panel today is going to discuss the future of drilling. And so let me just throw out to y'all, what are we going to do? Are we going to drill that oil that's sitting out there in 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 feet of water? And if so, how are we going to do it safely? And what's the role of the government in overseeing that process? So if each of you want to just talk about
Great.
For a minute or two.
I'll go first. Good. Joel mentioned that I am the head of Safety, Environment, and Sustainable Development for Shell for our upstream activities in the Western Hemisphere. And as you can imagine, with the Macondo incident, some really critical concerns and questions have been raised. Questions like, should we be drilling offshore or in the deep water? And our answer to those questions is very shortly, yes, but you have to do it right. So people are still debating, and you'll hear some of this at the forum this week. People are debating higher level questions, things like, should we be using oil? Should we be trying to locate more oil? And excuse me, the reality is, for the very near term, we need all the oil and gas that we can find and produce in order to keep our economies running. And it's going to take efforts from every part of government, every partner that we have out there to ensure that we can do that in a safe and reliable manner. So the Gulf of Mexico is very important. About 30% of the production of the U.S. production comes from the Gulf of Mexico. Much of that, the majority of that, comes from the deep water. And there are 170,000 jobs, direct jobs, associated with deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Having said all that, though, it's right, Americans rightly should expect that we can meet those energy needs in a safe and reliable manner. For some operators, for Shell and for some responsible operators, we know that if your primary focus is safe operations and conservative risk management, tragedies like the Macondo won't happen. We believe that. And we, Shell, have been very clear that Shell would not have designed or drilled the Macondo well in the same fashion that BP has done it. There is a long history, a long successful record of deep water drilling. Around the globe, there are about 14,000 wells drilled in the deep water so far, drilled successfully. And so the Macondo well is an outlier. It's an extreme. You know, the history will say that you can do this activity safely, and the Macondo well is far outside any of the norms that industry has experienced to date. So where do we go forward? Answering Joel's question, where do we go from here? And I'm going to answer it by telling you what Shell has done in response to the Macondo incident initially. We, of course, all of our procedures, all of our standards have been put under a microscope. We're looking for improvements in the areas of prevention, in the areas of well intervention and spill response. And we're looking for improvements in, of course, all of our well designs. We have increased our rig inspections. We have implemented new certifications around blowout preventers. And very importantly, I think you probably saw in the news last week, we have introduced the Marine Well Containment Company. It's a joint project between Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. And we are developing a dedicated full suite of containment equipment so that will dramatically enhance our ability to quickly get in and contain an underwater blowout. So it's insurance that we hope that we never need, but it's there for us. It's there for us now, or will be there for us when it's developed. So if anything good can come out of this tragedy, it's that we believe we can return to the deep water and drill safely and drill with even more environmental responsibility. We at Shell are determined that this incident won't happen again.
Before we go to Robert, can I just ask a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Why should the American people right now have faith in the oil industry to do what you just said?
Well, part of it is looking at history and understanding the actual findings from the incident itself. I think it's very important that we educate ourselves and learn exactly what happened and why that happened.
But you would agree that right now it is a tricky moment because people might be skeptical that the oil industry knows how to do this safely.
I would say that our industry has been set back decades as far as public trust goes. And it's our job to try and rebuild that trust, and we can do that a lot of ways. Speaking here at Aspen is a great one to try and provoke people to hear us and talk to us and tell us where we need to go. And, again, it's a long way. It's a long road, but we have to do it.
Robert?
I look at this from a scientific need and a science policy point of view. And by the way, I don't consider it a spill. It's a very big leak. Matter of fact, it's an extraordinary big leak.
Gusher.
Yeah, it's a gusher. Yeah, that's not a scientific term, but that's okay. And so from a scientific point of view, as we just heard, there are 14,000 deep wells that have been drilled already around the world. And I guess I come at it from the point of view that human error always exists. And so that means something might happen again. And so from a science point of view, then what can we do to react to that more quickly than this one? This was a big problem, obviously. The federal government, industry, NGOs, academia was not at all equipped to deal with this particular spill. And so what we've been doing with our member institutions and other organizations around the country is to try to put in place a plan for the future. For instance, the following question is asked. It's June 2025, and you all are home or at work, and you turn on your television, and all of a sudden you see an announcement that the biggest oil spill in history has just occurred. The point is, what questions would we have liked to have asked in 2010 and received answers from so that we are prepared for that particular spill? And that's the position that we've taken with our organization and our member institutions. One of the big problems that you need to be aware of with the science, you might ask, well, why don't we know more? Why did it take so long to figure out what the flow was? Why did it take so long to figure out where it was going? Was it in deep water? Why didn't it rise if the specific gravity of oil is so much less than water? What about the dispersants? Are they toxic or are they not toxic? Why are all these questions taking so long to be answered? How long is it going to take for the restoration? When can we start fishing? These are the kind of questions that we get all the time. As you probably heard this morning on a number of panels, the scientific process takes time. And there's a real danger in coming to a conclusion of one sample or two samples, or before Hurricane Alex or after Hurricane Alex. And consequently, we have to have a planning process in place in which we're ready. And I would suggest to you that we need an observation program. We need an ocean observation program. We need to be out there 24/7 collecting the kind of data we need, not just for oil spills, but for natural events, like red tide events, like the hypoxic events that we've heard about, so that we are prepared to deal with what happens to our ocean because we have the background data and we're ready to move on it. That's a big piece of this. The second piece is the complication of the NERDA process. What's the NERDA process? In 1990, the Oil Pollution Act was passed, and what that act has in it is a natural resource disaster assessment protocol. Now, that protocol was not designed for something that's 10 times as big as Exxon Valdez spill, but it's in place, and that's what we've got. That's not a scientific process. It's a litigious process. And with litigious process, if any of you have been involved in litigious processes, you recognize that it's mostly out of your control, which means it's out of the scientist's control. So the government is collecting data and making their case, and BP is collecting data to make their case. I want to remind you all that it took 18 years for the final settlement of the Exxon Valdez situation. 18 years. There's no reason to believe it won't take even longer for this one. So that means that a lot of data that's being collected is not being freely distributed. And I would argue we've got to have a process in place where the academic scientists, the NGOs, the industrial scientists, the states, and industry, and the other organizations can work together in a partnership for a national science program to address these issues ahead of time.
Great. Bruce?
Well, I'm going to be the skunk at this garden party. This was an accident waiting to happen. And it's going to happen again unless there is some radical thought to restructuring all of the relations in this industry. And furthermore, we shouldn't even be out there drilling offshore in deep water unless we can conclude that it is possible to say there will be no more accidents. Now, Shell says we'll never have an accident because we're a good company. Okay, assume that. But what about all the other people out there? What about all the other contractors, drillers, oil companies? This is an unregulated frontier culture out there full of cowboy operators who range from good to bad to terrible. So I hear what Shell says. That doesn't say a word about zero accident futures and how we prevent them. I appreciate all the academics and all the science that are saying we got to know more about how to clean spills up. But if we're going to have more spills, we can't be out there drilling. We got to face up to one basic issue. How do we say we're going to structure an industry in which there will not be any more accidents? Well, when I say that, people say, well, you were Secretary of the Interior. You have the regulatory agency. We'll just tell them to get busy. Well, let me tell you that this accident could have happened on my watch. It could have happened last year, the year before. It can happen in the future. And the reason is that this is essentially an unregulated industry. It is an unregulated industry. People say, well, you surely don't mean that. MMS is out there. MMS is so woefully inadequate to this issue that we can't go back into that gulf by just saying, hire more people for the Mineral Management Agency. Why? I'm going to give you just two reasons and then make a few suggestions. First of all, the MMS does not have the statutory authority to regulate this industry. Can I say that again? I want to say that again. The MMS does not have the statutory authority to regulate this industry. Do they regulate BP? Well, by a far stretch of the imagination, you might say, well, BP at least had a permit. But on the day of that accident out in the Gulf, there were on that platform 133 employees. 126 of them were working for companies that are not regulated by the Interior Department or the United States government. 126 employees working for Transocean, Halliburton, all of the contractors are cowboys out there who are in an unregulated segment of the industry. There were 8 BP employees there. That's how diffuse and unregulated this industry is. They were drilling on a platform, the Deepwater Horizon, owned by a Swiss corporation, sailing under a flag of convenience from the Marshall Islands. Your Gulf is being managed by a ship from the Marshall Islands. It would be like taking a nuclear power plant down the road and saying, we'll delegate it to Paraguay to run a nuclear power plant. That's the level of unregulated chaos in this industry. People say, well, maybe Congress can fix up the MMS. What they've done so far in this administration is give the agency a new name. This is my idea of cosmetic regulation. What do we call it now? The Bureau of Ocean Energy?
Management, regulation, and enforcement.
By whatever name, it's still the MMS. It is an agency which has at its core an irreconcilable conflict of interest. It both promotes and regulates. It promotes by listening to people in Congress who are getting campaign contributions from the oil industry saying, look at all this royalty money. We need it to reduce the deficit. Get out there. More leases, more production. Cozy up to the oil industry. Let's get out there and get that revenue flowing. And oh, incidentally, you might issue a few regulations along the way. Don't you see the conflict? And what it means, and what has not been attended yet, either by the Congress or the Obama administration, is a facing up to that fact and saying there must be an independent regulatory agency, free of all conflicts. Will Shell Oil agree to that?
We agree to regulations.
Independent
Support
regulation,
regulations.
not in the Mineral Management Service, in a brand new, real regulatory agency?
We are confident that we're going to meet whatever regulations come out of this incident.
Okay, that was an unfair question. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to turn Shell into a straw man. But you get the idea.
Yeah.
And how might that be done? It might be done, in conclusion, because I recognize that even though I'm a politician, I do not have license to talk forever, at least to this audience. But we got to have an independent, standalone regulatory agency. When you have these low probability, high risk scenarios with the possibilities of catastrophic consequences, you can't bury the regulation down deep in a licensing agency that's selling licenses. The model to start with is nuclear power. We had a big accident back in 1978, a devastating accident. Hasn't happened since, and the reason is that industry is now presided over by an independent commission called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and nobody gets near a nuclear power plant without an individual certificate and license from the federal government, which has been issued as a result of a training program, which is regulated by the federal government, and a plant which is certified by the federal government, by the agency, and run in compliance with broad-based, comprehensive, prescriptive regulation. Now, I got to tell you, it's a great disappointment to me that we're not hearing that debate yet. But if we want to continue drilling in deep water, we can't say they're all like Shell. We've got to say there's a whole universe of players out there running wild, and we've got to get serious about managing the risks and managing down to zero possibility of another accident like this.
All right. All right. Kevin, where do we go from here?
Oh, she wants to get me. Dams?
Natural gas. Natural gas.
Oh,
Saying the same thing applies to natural
I'm sorry,
gas.
of course. Well, oil is shorthand for oil and gas.
Okay. Thank you. Kevin?
Well, I'm just as surprised to see you here as maybe you are to see me. There's, if you see me talking to the young lady in front here, it's my daughter, and I'm looking for help on big words and a lot of initials. So I've always counted on her, and so when my feeling about the disaster, or whatever you want to call it, is we actually don't have a word that is big enough or is ugly enough to describe what's going on. That's my first observation as I listen to everybody talking. We don't have the word to describe what's happened down there. We also heard we talk about the notion of that it's our ocean, and I know that that's not what anybody meant, but I do think that somewhere that's gotten very lost in this whole discussion are the rest of our neighbors who share the Gulf of Mexico, who are wondering if this oil is going to wash up on their beach and destroy their way of life, sour their own proverbial swimming hole. And so people that you'll never meet, that we'll never know, have this wondering of these black plumes that are perhaps ranging in the Gulf. Are they going to land on their shore? Are they going to escape to the Atlantic? Or have they just disappeared? Seems to be a thing that's being thrown out now that they have somehow gone away. I hear everything that's talking about it, and what's been very frustrating for me, and I would imagine what's very frustrating you, is why aren't we doing something? We're pretty smart, If any industry that can drill through depths of water that they do, miles into the core of the earth to get oil, somehow doesn't have the logic, the science, or the will to develop machinery that will clean up a spill that will actually occur, and will never get away from things not happening. That will never, ever happen. These spills are going to continue today and tomorrow, and they're happening somewhere in the world today. I woke up out of my dream state after the Exxon Valdez, seeing what were the same familiar images that we've all have seen, which is that dark pudding kind of coming up onto shore, the requisite number of birds in awkward positions, and our own fellow citizens standing with rubber boots and pitchforks and hay. And that same image has progressed for 30 years, and I guess progressed is the wrong word. It's the same image that we've had. And there's this helplessness, and I'm reminded of, I don't want to equate myself to this cat, but we all feel at a loss. I mean, I remember when our whole nation was being formed, we had these brains, we had Adams, and we had Jefferson and Franklin, and these guys who were all fighting each other, incredibly intelligent men. Who's going to run the country? Who's going to run this country? And they all had arguments, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought. And finally, one guy stands up, Washington. He goes, look, everybody, I'll go raise an army. I'll pay for it, and we'll go fight these guys. And the room just got silent. And that was Washington. And at the end of the day, all these guys laid down and said, why don't you be president, George? I think we're all looking for a brick and mortar solve. And after seeing those images for so long, something in me woke up. I don't have the math. When you talk about academia, I was always in the back of the class. My daughter's here to help me. I couldn't get us to the moon. But there was something that started to bug me about this continual image. I said, why can't we separate oil and water at high speeds? And so I found a technology in the Department of Energy. It was about this big. And I figured if I could scale that up, that I could clean up the Exxon Valdez in my own mind. And so I started, and I went out, and I got 20 engineers and scientists. And we began in a small little warehouse. And 3 years later, we had a machine that stood 8 foot tall. and would separate oil and water at high speeds up to 200 gallons a minute. And had my machines been in the Exxon Valdez, 90% of that oil, if I would have had 20 of my machines on the spot, 90% of that oil would have been cleaned up in in 1 week, given the water conditions. That became my mandate to these guys. How could we clean this up? And so I did it. And I thought gravity would fall to my door. I thought industry would rush to me. I thought the federal government, who's in charge of protecting us, would say, yes, this is good. But it wasn't. And $24 million and 15 years later, my equipment sat idly on the shelf. And had my equipment been out there, we wouldn't have stopped this leak, but we would have fought it right at its point of impact. I believe that this could do this. And I ran up against the federal government. I ran up against the EPA and all this stuff. And then industry, we're not going to have a spill. It was very frustrating for a private investor, and I did. I put about $24 million after tax. I think you all know what that means. It really was. And so I've always been about a solve. I've been about why can't we confront this? Why can't we have an overwhelming response to an accident that we know is going to happen? And so as I calculate the spill that was coming out, it would have required about 70 of my machines. Essentially what would happen is the machines that I created turn every piece of equipment that's hovering around the deep water horizon into something incredibly efficient. Because you hear the word skimmers, you hear all this different stuff. What's happening is they're picking up water, and they're picking up sometimes 20% oil, usually 80% water. Or maybe they get a higher ratio. It doesn't really matter. What I developed was something that would actually separate that oil and water at high speeds so those ships could stay out there. They wouldn't have to come inshore. And when they finally did come inshore, they would come inshore with an entire 100% payload of oil. My machine, I was asked again to go out there. For 20 years, 15 years, I was begging to go out on oil spills, and there was a catch-22 that existed in the government and the oil industry and managed to keep me away. But we're now out on the water. I have 13 machines out on the water. The truth is, what I believe is the equipment that we have developed is the way that oil spills will be confronted in the 21st century. The sad part is it has sat idly on the shelf for 12 years. The simple answer to what everybody in this room, all of us know, is that we have to know that there's going to be spills, not only in our saltwater, but in our freshwater bodies, okay? And so as intelligent people, what do we say about that? I couldn't do anything about the leak, but I can do something about the oil that comes to the top. You don't need dispersants to fight this. In fact, the machines that we developed, and so robustly so, do better without the dispersants. In fact, when it finally got BP's attention is when they realized that they could resell their asset, that my machine cleans the oil so quickly and so purely. And so really, it's pretty dumbbell math, to be honest. It's dumbbell math. You take what's worst case scenario. You always start with that. What's the worst case scenario? And so if it's 100,000 barrels a day, you back the math out, right? I ask you any, but probably everybody else knows that. Whatever the math is, that's what you throw at it. That's what you throw at it. And you have assets in place. The oil industry should be required. And you mentioned one thing I would like to say. A new agency is being formed. What did you call it? The new group that the oil companies are...
It's a joint company, so
right.
It's a privately owned company.
There's also a company that exists, which is the MSRC, which is a joint company that the oil companies have also funded. I think it's a mistake fundamentally to let that group decide what would be safe and what would be an overwhelming response. I think you could weigh in. I think you could weigh in because we do need the advice of experts, but sometimes experts, they intimidate us. You don't need this, that's a redundancy. You don't need this, that's a redundancy. And I realize that you're on the hot seat in front of everyone, representing this thing. So as a fellow human being, I'm not trying to put pressure on you. But I would say that we don't need to just come up to the bar of safety. We need to hurl ourselves over it. We need to have an overwhelming response the same way we would as if anything was attacking us. And this is, in fact, attacking us. And there is a logic, it's number, and it's dollars that the oil industry has plenty of. And it's about time that the fact that it's not sexy because it's not a profit center, safety never is. It is never a profit center. And I said, I made an analogy, and I'll quit in Congress, where I talked about, a beautiful yacht that's sailing, and it's something that we'd all like to have. The helicopter on top, and probably some of you do. It's got an extra 180-foot fishing boat that's going beside it. It's got the jet skis. It's got the works. It's got what we all want, right? And it's, and all of a sudden, something happens, and this yacht's going down. Okay, it's going down. The helicopter's gone. The fishing boat's sunk. The jet skis, they're gone. And the only thing that you have to save life and limb at this moment on this $50 million yacht, to save your wife, your children, is this little orange, ugly life preserver that you've stowed away and you've stowed out of sight. And that is the difference. That's the thing that keeps you afloat. Any industry that's going to operate 24/7 at the depths around the world has the obligation to be the first response to an accident that is happening. If you are transporting oil across any one of our oceans, in our ports, drilling, you have logic. It is your responsibility that you have to have a legitimate response to something that's happened. If you're cut here, an artery, you will use your hand. So there should be a minimum of this type, not necessarily my equipment, anybody else's, but it should be there. Because you can only hold this for so long. And it's such a dangerous thing that at a certain point, you have to get to the hospital. When you get to the hospital, then somebody's going to take over. An immediate first response has to be in place in this industry wherever oil can come into contact with water in a significant way. And short of that, an overwhelming response has to be logistically within 2 to 3 hours. And you base a plan based on that. And it wouldn't be hard to do. And you actually have to have the kind of machines to do that. I do. I said in Congress, that sounds like I'm hawking my stuff. I'm not. It may sound like it, but I'm excited to see something else on the chalkboard. And if it is, I would love to see that. And as my daughter aptly said, just before I went, and she goes, Dad, when there's a spill anywhere, it hurts us everywhere.
Okay, we want to go to your questions in just a moment here, but let me just, as a reporter, ask a couple follow-ups real fast. So I just want a quick answer, if I could. Bruce, what would you have done differently if you could be Secretary of Interior again, go back in time, and deal with MMS differently in the 1990s?
What I would have done differently in 1992 is everything that I just told you should be done in the future. Now, did I know that in 1992? No. This accident could have happened on my watch. And this is not about blaming anybody looking backward. It's about drawing the lessons from what went on and saying, now let's make the changes on all fronts, prevention, cleanup, the whole thing.
Why did the Obama administration decide to greenlight drilling a month before this disaster?
Joe, I don't think you can lay too heavy a rap on them. Why did they do it? Because they wanted an energy policy which would satisfy the Republican majority in the United States Senate that we had enough energy alternatives that they would support cap and trade. That's why he did it.
Right.
Was it an irrational decision? No. Okay. Had this accident occurred before then, would it have happened? No.
Okay. Robert, what's the condition of the Gulf right now? And based on the science that you've seen, how long is the Gulf going to be polluted and devastated by this event?
So, Joe, I've been asked that question maybe 100 times, and the answer is we just don't know. And the reason why we don't know is we don't have the assets out there right now. The data, as I said, that's being collected, most of the data is being collected for litigation. And there's no major federal response for peer-reviewed research. What's interesting, what many of you might find rather ironic, is that BP announced over a month ago, almost 2 months ago now, a $500 million research program. And this research program had nothing to do with the NERDA process. It was going to be a peer-reviewed program that was going to be managed by third party. They were going to decide on the themes, but the themes were pretty broad, like the fates and effect, ecological fates and effect of the oil spill over time. And the third party was going to bring reviewers together, much like many of you may be familiar with the National Science Foundation process, where there are scientists that review the proposals that are not part of the proposal process. In other words, they're not looking for money. There are panels that then get assembled. The proposals get prioritized. And the proposals are based on the quality, the intellectual quality, the expertise of the people, the credibility of the scientists, the chances for success, and the infrastructure that they have available and the budget. And that program was about to happen. But when the $20 billion was put on the table by BP for the claimant piece, the research proposal piece was then passed back, and now BP is talking to the governors and to the state agencies about how best to, quote unquote, use that money. And so that to me is very ironic that BP is the one that came up with the peer-reviewed process. We don't have that right now, and that's the problem, Joe. We don't have it.
Quick question for Libby. How specifically would Shell have drilled that well differently than the way BP drilled it?
Can I first clarify a couple things that I feel really need to be stated? First, one of the things I did not say was that this would never happen to Shell, or that this couldn't happen to Shell. This is a very risky business that we work in. We recognize that. We plan for it. When we design a well, we try to understand what all those risks might be, and we put multi-tiers of mitigations in place, things of protections in place. So I'm not going to sit here and say it couldn't happen, but I am going to say that that we have done a very good job of trying to anticipate those risks. And we're going back. We've learned a lot from this incident, as I'm sure everybody has, and we're going to make those things better too. And I was very sincere when I said that we welcome the regulation that's coming. We're not going to object to that.
What about Bruce's point that there's a cowboy mentality with all these contractors who are out there? Doesn't Shell work with Transocean, Halliburton, M.I. Sueco, Schlumberger, all these other folks in the same kind of atmosphere of light regulation that he's describing?
Absolutely. We work with all of the major service companies, and I have to differ. I don't believe that it could be described as a cowboy mentality. There are some professionals with years and years of experience who have only safety on their mind. And we talked about the value of safety also. You know, within Shell, and I know within other majors also, we're willing to pay, we're willing to shut down, we're willing to take the steps it needs to do things safely. That's clear to our employees, that's clear to our contractors. We want them to stop if they see a situation that's unsafe.
Look, we're at Aspen. Cowboy is the only adjective I could think of.
Yeah, you meant it in a good way. Questions from the audience? And
we can go back and be specific about this. First of all, I want to refer you, though, at the Ideas Festival, we had John Halliwell, who's here today, and another of our well managers, Joe Limecooler, who did an excellent description of exactly what you're talking about, the differences between how Shell typically drills a well to our standards versus what happened. And you're looking at, from fundamental well design, the number of casing strings that we put in a well, the number of lockdowns that we use, just really from the bottom up, there are a whole series of techniques that are part of our standard global procedures that differed from BP.
Okay, we have 20 minutes, and I want to get your questions. I have one last question though for Kevin Costner. What was it like dealing with BP? Did you feel like that they were prepared for the scale of this disaster? I mean, you had negotiations with them, didn't you?
Yeah, I don't know. They weren't prepared for it, nor were the rest of the oil companies, because they all had the same plan. That was pretty clear in Congress. You know, I think a big question is what would give all of us a warm and fuzzy feeling about what you all are doing. And I made that little analogy of the boat, the expensive boat, and where I want it to go, really to the point is, it's too bad that we have to regulate so much, you know, for companies that make so much. It would seem like as their pile gets bigger, they could look to, like, you know, we should be looking for the best technology, and we should have our own R&D departments about how to clean up oil spills. That would be number one, I think, very, very important. But if you look at the way any of us operate on the water, if you go out and rent a boat right now, it's going to have to have a life preserver on it. It's going to have maybe a fire extinguisher. If it's a large enough boat, it has to have a lifeboat. Right? We all look at that and we understand the logic of it. We go, yeah, that's right. In fact, if we don't see that red thing there, that doesn't make us feel that comfortable. I'm saying in the oil industry, what I had said to BP is that these things should be on the oil derricks. They should be on the service providers that are transporting back and forth, doing things, so that if they all have these on there, if an alarm is set off, they can all rush to that point and have a tendency to hold the oil back at that point, knowing that more robust ships, almost fire engine type boats that comes with 20 machines like mine or somebody else's, that come and have what I call, and I use the word, a legitimate response. I mean, sometimes you have an oil spill in the kitchen, you come in and you go, here's your bucket. Well, you got a bucket. There's oil in it. Well, we could use a mop. We could use there's things that create an efficiency in cleaning up, and efficiency is sorely lacking in the equipment that's out there. You know, they're filling up with oil and water, and they sit there. What do we do with it? We wait for it to settle. But they were not prepared.
Okay. Question right here. Now, grab a microphone. The lady right here in the middle.
Hi, I have a brief comment for Kevin and then a question for Your Excellency Babbitt. Kevin, I don't know if you know that on July 16th, China had a spill also, an oil pipeline exploded.
What spill on the 16th?
July 16th, China had its largest oil spill, because of an oil pipeline burst. And I think they would very much welcome your technology.
I have been contacted.
So question, some of the comments that I heard about what slowed down the recovery process was things like people who wanted to help needed to get a permit to go out. They couldn't get a permit, that the next day they needed to get a permit from somebody else, and et cetera. So that's different from the recovery plans that a Shell or an Exxon or a BP should have. That's more just sort of general bureaucratic stuff. So how does the Secretary of the Interior or somebody in the government help improve that system for people who want to get involved?
Well, the answer, of course, is a robust regulatory agency whose sole responsibility is to anticipate and be ready for these things. Now, there is a little wrinkle here that I think needs work in the future. Obviously, there was some real conflict between the state of Louisiana and the federal agencies. It was not just bureaucratic. The governor of Louisiana was out there in his inimitable, hyper, sort of rushing way, saying, we're going to build sand berms all the way across, and I, the governor of Louisiana, can tell you that those sand berms are the answer. Awful lot of scientists who are saying, no way, they will make the matter worse. And, you know, next time that issue will have been settled. But it would have been wrong for the federal agencies to cave to the governor over these sand berms.
You know, all due respect, it is a bureaucratic snafu. For the last 10 years, it was you can't clean up water if you can't get it down to 15 parts per million. You can't tell me the American public wouldn't have been satisfied if we got 50% of the oil out of a spill, let alone the oil that's coming out down to 9 to 15 parts per million. And that was the big rub for my equipment not being able to go on to oil spills. Well, can you get it down to 15 parts per million? That's what has kept the machinery off the water and not being able to respond. Since then, I have gone to the world's leaders in membrane technology, and I'm now down to 5 parts per million. And my goal is to get down to non-detectable things. But that's what kept us off the water was the EPA because based on their things. And my simple point to them was, if oil is already in the water, then it's already in the ecosystem. So if I clean what's in the ecosystem and the oil that's going into a tank is 99.9% pure oil, and the water that's going out has 100 parts per million or whatever, what's the difference? And it's hard to find somebody to cut through that common sense. As a first line of defense, that kind of machinery was not available to the American public is a tragedy.
Question over here. Sir, please stand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I'm an attorney. I'm dismayed at the concept that data that's being collected is being collected and hoarded by various agencies, companies, and so forth, and groups with respect to the idea mind of litigation. There should be, the federal government should be saying any data collected should be turned over to a common data bank so that that data is available for the research that Shell has to do, for Bruce Babbitt's research, and for Kevin Costner's research.
Well, yeah.
Why is it being category being set aside for each company or each person's interest with the idea in mind of litigation?
All right,
20 years
Robert?
will be a minimum time.
Okay.
This,
Thank you.
This actually ties into the last question. There are 46 committees in Congress that deal with the oceans. Let's start with that. There are numerous federal agencies that have responsibilities in the coastal zone. And so one of the reasons why there was a big delay was that reason. The Coast Guard now, the Coast Guard commander, the former commander is now in charge of that. But there are all kinds of regulations with each agency that gets involved. And that ties into your question. The agencies are out there collecting data, but they're collecting it for their agencies. There is a central database that's just been stood up last week from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But it takes a long time to get this going, and it goes back to what everybody's been saying here. We were completely ill-prepared for this. You were all ill-prepared. What did you think when it first went? Oh, it looks like it's only 5,000 barrels a day. Well, that's not a lot. And then all of a sudden, the numbers started going up and went down and went up and went down. And pretty soon, it was a month. And so consequently, none of us were ready for this. But I will say to you that Bruce's idea, I think, is a really good one because there's too many agencies involved, and it's too chaotic. I've been in Washington now for 3 years, and I thought I knew it. I do nothing about it until I got there.
Let's go to another question on the left here.
I worked on the Persian Gulf spill extensively, and the oil fires as well.
Speak up a little bit.
And one of the things that we found in the Persian Gulf all those years ago, 19 years ago, was that there was a press blackout. And effectively, there has been a press blackout of what's really happening in the Gulf, too. And people who've been down there know this. What's going on down there, as Kevin said, is indescribable. And if the American people were allowed access even to the visual data of dolphin pods writhing on the surface, dying, if they were allowed
Hold
to
on,
know...
do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
The question is this, and Bruce Babbitt, I think that this would be a really, because I thank you so much for being so honest. We need somehow or other to find a way, and I would like to ask the panel, what ways would you suggest to get this administration to remove the restrictions on the flow of data out of the Gulf immediately, so we can actually have the political will polarized in in the country in a good way for the cleanup.
Does anyone want to weigh in on that, Bruce?
Look, I think all these questioners are right. The data ought to be transparent and immediately available everywhere.
Okay, all right. This gentleman right here has been raising his hand forever. Yeah, okay, we have to wrap this up in 10 minutes. So we have quick questions and quick answers. Yes, sir.
Andy Revkin, NewYorkTimes.org blog.
Oh, yeah.
This is for Libby Cheney and maybe a little bit of Bruce. The single most jarring moment I had in 3 months of covering this on my blog came here in Aspen several weeks ago when I saw that presentation. I wrote about it after the fact. And what it showed is this unbelievable gulf between worst practice and best practice. And it's fine for you now as Shell to say, oh, we'd never do it that way. But where was Shell? I imagine Shell and the American Petroleum Institute, et cetera, were not exactly encouraging MMS to make only the best practice the norm in these quick approvals that were happening. So I get the sense I get some disingenuous feelings here. Why is the industry supporting such a gap between worst practice and best practice?
Well, I think it's completely off base to say that they're supporting a gap between best practice and worst practice. I do think that, you know.
Were you unaware of the difference? Was no one at Shell aware of the difference?
I mean, we're doing our business in the Gulf. We're not out there trying to figure out how everybody else is doing theirs. We do have mechanisms through API that we share drilling standards and we share best practices. We're a global company. We're drilling all over the world, and so we're incorporating our own best practices into our standards. But I really, to imply that there's something that we might have been doing to push away progress in that area is just false, because we want to learn, we want to do the best we can, and it really has been up to the corporation to have social responsibility, to be able to have the kind of standards to make these things work without the kind of incidents we're seeing. So it's going to change, I think, and soon we'll have regulation that helps us fill that gap. But no, actively trying to preserve some differences or deny that there are better practices out there, no.
Back at the window.
I have a brief comment for Kevin and a question for Elizabeth. I'd like to respectfully disagree with the notion that safety is not a profit core for oil companies. I don't think that BP has gained any revenue from this spill. I think its retail operations have suffered greatly. My question for Elizabeth is, do you know the data or have any idea of how much market share you've captured at your retail operations as a result of BP's mishap? And also, do you think that there is a marketplace reward for investing in safe operations?
I'm going to answer the second one first, if you will. Safety at Shell is a value. And we understand that to remain viable long-term, we must do everything we do in a safe manner. So I can't answer your question about market share. I do believe it's probably been distributed across a lot of companies, and so for Shell alone, this hasn't been a big boon in any way. The entire industry is suffering from this. So.
Question in the back.
This is for Ms. Cheney. I'm just wondering, I trusted that you would want to share the information you've gotten from re-examining your safety practices. Mm-hmm. You said you did the deep dive, I'm sorry, no pun, after the accident to look at things and how you guys could avoid an accident, if at all possible. I don't know, I'm wondering, have you offered to share that with BP? Not that they would be very receptive to it, but have you offered to share that? And do you know if the Obama administration might be requiring BP to, get with people like you, some of the the other oil companies to, learn what they can?
Yeah, within one day after the incident, BP had put out a call and requested our expertise, and we willingly shared much of our deepwater drilling expertise that carried those best practices along with them. So it has been shared, and not only Shell's, but other companies too joined in that. So it was very much an effort to bring all of that best knowledge together in one place. As a requirement, I think I certainly don't take issue with any of the comments about building a best practices database along with the other data that's flowing in, and let that inform the regulations.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this question is for Bruce Babbitt. You know, the tragedy in the Gulf has brought some much needed attention to the need for offshore regulatory reform, but we're having disasters happen onshore as well, and there's an equal need for reform onshore. 5.2 million gallons spilled in Colorado of drilling-related fluids in the last 2.5 years, and that's in Colorado alone. And I'm wondering how can, you know, we're seeing the response in Congress and at the administrative level so pointed at offshore reform measures, but how can we make that link to the critical onshore regulatory reforms that are also needed and accompany those offshore reform needs?
No, look, I agree with you completely. Comprehensive reform, offshore and onshore, on land, is the order of the day. The issues are a little different because of the state, federal, and regulatory structures. There's no question that we got a long ways to go, both on and offshore.
Right here in the middle.
Okay, we had a lot of horrific pictures of surface oil devastation and then a lot of talk about surface oil collection. But it seems to me that the big issue that's come up in this, because it's a deep water, is all the deep water oil plumes. And nobody's mentioned that really so far.
Robert, was it a mistake to allow dispersants to be used at the source at the bottom?
Well, dispersants have been used routinely in a lot of these spills for several years, and there's been a lot of studies on the toxicity of the dispersants. What we don't know, to answer your question, what we don't know is what is the reactivity with the oil? And for instance, there are a lot of toxic components in oil, and are you going to concentrate those in the dispersants? There's a lot of research. There is a lot of research going on in the government laboratories now. I know that there's a lot going on in the NOAA labs and a lot going on in the EPA labs. To my knowledge, this much dispersant, Elizabeth probably knows more about this than I do, but this much dispersant being delivered right to the source of the spill is unprecedented. I mean,
Was it a mistake?
It's over 1 million. I don't know if it's a mistake because we don't know the toxicity. And that's something that's being studied now, and the government laboratories are working on it.
Okay.
So,
I think
just
you know what? There's a fundamental problem with this dispersant thing. You know, I don't want to keep bringing things back to my own little world, but think about this. I can't have a machine out there that gets rid of 15 parts per million of oil in the water, but the oil companies can put something incredibly toxic right in the water, right at the source. There's something fundamentally wrong with that idea.
All right.
And with that in mind, I came 15 minutes to get here. I came a long ways. I could have rolled down here.
You go ahead.
But dispersants, I want to say this: dispersants shouldn't be used if you have equipment in place, because it'll come to the top, you can see it. They don't have to be used. We don't have to pollute the ocean more to clean it.
Very good. Back in the back.
Hi. This is for Elizabeth, but everybody in general. I'm looking at a statistic here from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is the leading source of information about all of energy use. And it says very clearly that of all the liquid fuel that we use in the United States, bearing in mind that 60% is imported, 8% comes from Gulf of Mexico offshore production. 8%. That's not a very big amount. It seems to me we could all conserve and do away with the need for oil from the Gulf if we wanted to. My question for Shell is, we all have to reduce our fossil fuel use by as much as 80% by 2050. That's what we have to do about climate change. What's your company doing to encourage this, and what amount of money are you putting into this to help us all use down to, only about 20% of what we're using now within a few years?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to answer that. That's kind of a different angle than we've talked about today. My company is looking forward to 2050, to the end of the century, and looking at what the possibilities are for changing from fossil fuels to renewables, and we are looking as a business enterprise, mind you. As a business enterprise, we are looking for the solutions that are going to be commercially viable. So we are investing heavily in biofuels, in wind. We, I think probably of all the majors, have the broadest portfolio of alternatives and renewables. And we're doing not only research, but we're commercializing those things. So we see a picture of the future that looks very much, I think, like what everybody else here sees. And we're approaching it from the viewpoint of a business who has an obligation to invest in some of those different technologies.
We have time for a really quick question.
Okay, for Ms. Babbitt and Secretary Babbitt and Ms. Cheney, please speak to the culture within the oil industry and so many others about there were the people on that rig who were afraid to speak, and to what extent some credibility that this has not been addressed here, and it could have prevented the whole thing.
So on paper, people are told if you have a problem, you can stop the drilling at any point, anyone on the rig. In reality, does that happen?
I'll take a shot at this. I think those of you who have worked with industry realize that there is a different culture when you go company to company. We're not all the same. Cultural impacts come from company leadership. So you can have these great policies and you can tell people you want them to intervene, but you also have to have leadership that's out there every day focusing on that and making that happen and supporting the people who are doing it. So we're not going to come up with a cultural answer, one size fits all, to these types of things. Each and every company is going to have to examine their own leadership structure, and culture change is not a small thing. It's a very long journey, and at Shell we've been working on it for a long time too to get to the point where we are.
Any final comments? Someone's dying to make a comment.
Just want to say one thing about this. In order to really make this work, you've got to change the culture, not just of Shell, but of the entire industry. And the way industries change their culture is when they are in a dynamic relationship with strong, comprehensive regulation, which is giving them incentives to get moving, to change their culture. You've got to have both.
Last comment from Mr. Costner here.
Yeah, I'd like to go to those meetings that you're talking about with other companies about safety and about how to respond. I'd love to be included in that dialogue, my company. Thank you.
All right.
You're formally invited.
Good.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, panel.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's a set of concurrent sessions this afternoon in your agenda. There is something called In Conversation at 4:45. There are 2 sessions this afternoon, and just want to make sure that you check your bulletin board out front for what's happening. There are also the Aspen Institute Energy and Environment Awards at the Pepke Auditorium at 6 p.m.
In theory, at least, Shell might be interested in a really small project if there's media and PR. Corporate image, responsibility. These are projects that are worthwhile on their own, of course.
Folks, we'll be starting our